Picture this. Wooden houses lean against each other like dominoes, their upper floors so close that neighbors pass bread between windows. Church bells echo through smoke-filled alleys where rats scurry through rivers of human waste. The stench of 500,000 souls packed into 1 square mile rises with the morning fog. This is London, September 1666, and in 72 hours it will cease to exist. But tonight, using advanced AI technology, we've resurrected this lost city from the ashes. We've transformed 300-year-old sketches, forgotten architectural surveys, and smoke-damaged paintings into living, breathing scenes. You're about to smell the pitch-covered walls that became fuel, hear the roar of superheated air creating its own weather system, and stand beside Samuel Pepys as molten lead from cathedral roofs runs through the streets like rivers of silver death. You'll witness the moment a single spark in a baker's oven ignited a firestorm that would consume 13,000 homes and accidentally give birth to modern urban civilization. Because here's what nobody tells you about the Great Fire of London. It didn't destroy a city, it created a blueprint. Every skyscraper, every fire code, every insurance policy in the modern world carries DNA from those 4 days of flame. How did the worst urban disaster in British history accidentally design the city you're living in right now? September 2nd, 1666. Thomas Fariner closes the damper on his oven in Pudding Lane, a narrow street near London Bridge where the air perpetually smells of fresh bread and horse manure. He's the king's baker, a respectable tradesman in a city of tradesmen. As he climbs the wooden stairs to his bedroom above the shop, a single ember, no bigger than a fingernail, falls through a crack in the oven floor. It lands on a pile of firewood. For 2 hours, it smolders in the darkness. At 2 in the morning, Fariner wakes to smoke so thick he can taste it. The ground floor is already an inferno. He gathers his family and they escape through an upstairs window, crawling across the rooftops. But his maidservant, too terrified to climb, becomes the first official victim of what will become the greatest urban disaster in British history. Within an hour, the fire has consumed 3 houses. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, is dragged from his bed to assess the situation. He looks at the flames, yawns, and declares, "A woman could piss it out." Then he goes back to sleep. This was not unusual arrogance. London had burned before. Small fires were so common that every parish had its own firefighting equipment, leather buckets, fire hooks to pull down burning thatch, and primitive water squirts that looked like giant syringes. The city had survived for 600 years this way. But 1666 was different. London hadn't seen significant rain in months. The Thames was low. The wooden city was bone dry, and a strong east wind was beginning to blow. To understand why London burned so completely, we must first understand what London was. By 1666, it was the largest city in Britain and one of the great capitals of Europe, home to nearly 500,000 people, almost a tenth of England's entire population. But it was still fundamentally a medieval city. The street plan hadn't changed since Roman times. The city was contained within ancient walls, with 7 gates that were locked every night. Inside those walls, 13,200 houses were crammed into just 436 acres. The buildings themselves were disasters waiting to happen. The ground floors were often stone or brick, but the upper stories were timber frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of straw, animal hair, and clay. Each successive floor jutted out further than the one below, a construction technique called jettying, until the houses at the top nearly touched across the street, blocking out sunlight and trapping smoke. The roofs were covered with thatch or wooden shingles, often waterproofed with pitch, essentially tar. The entire city was a tinderbox. But it wasn't just the buildings. London's medieval economy created perfect conditions for catastrophe. Every trade had its own quarter. Along the Thames were warehouses packed with combustibles: hemp, pitch, oil, tallow, brandy, sugar, coal, and gunpowder. The merchants stored their entire fortunes in these wooden warehouses, believing that proximity to the river protected them from fire. They were wrong. By dawn on September 2nd, the fire had consumed most of Pudding Lane and was advancing toward Fish Street Hill. The firefighting methods of the time were proving useless. The leather fire buckets, passed hand to hand from the river, were like teaspoons against an ocean. The fire hooks couldn't work fast enough. The only effective method was to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the fire's path. But this required permission from the property owners. And in a city where a house was a family's entire wealth, nobody wanted to be the first to sacrifice their home. Samuel Pepys, whose diary gives us the most vivid eyewitness account, walked through the city that Sunday morning. He describes seeing pigeons, refusing to leave their roosts, hovering at windows until their wings burned and they fell into the flames. He saw cats and rats fleeing in armies through the streets. The very air seemed to burn. Pieces of silk and paper, set alight and carried by the wind, were starting new fires miles from the original source. The fire was creating its own weather system, a phenomenon modern firefighters call a firestorm, where the heat creates powerful updrafts that suck in fresh oxygen and spread burning debris across vast distances. By Sunday afternoon, the fire had reached the warehouses on the Thames. When it hit the stored tallow and oil, the flames exploded upward with such intensity that they could be seen from Oxford, 60 miles away. The heat was so intense that iron bars in windows melted and ran down walls like water. Lead from church roofs formed rivers in the streets. Stone churches didn't burn, but they exploded. The limestone, heated to extreme temperatures, turned to quicklime. When firefighters threw water on it, it reacted violently, sending razor-sharp stone fragments flying like shrapnel. King Charles II, who had returned to the throne just 6 years earlier after the chaos of the Civil War, took personal command of the firefighting efforts. This was unprecedented. The Stuart kings were not known for getting their hands dirty, but Charles rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a fire bucket, and worked alongside common laborers in the smoke and heat. He authorized the demolition of buildings without waiting for permission from owners. He stationed guards to prevent looting. He set up fire posts manned by soldiers and volunteers, creating London's first organized disaster response system. But the fire was moving faster than human organization could match. By Monday, it had jumped the Fleet River, which was supposed to be a natural fire break. It was advancing on multiple fronts simultaneously. In the wealthy district of Cheapside, merchants were throwing their gold and silver into the Thames, hoping to recover it later. Others hired carts at astronomical prices to carry their goods out of the city. The roads became so clogged that the price of a cart went from a few shillings to £40, more than a laborer's yearly wage. The social fabric was disintegrating as fast as the physical city. Rumors spread that the fire was deliberately set by Catholic agents, or Dutch spies, or French saboteurs. England was at war with both Holland and France, and paranoia was rampant. Foreign merchants were attacked in the streets. A French watchmaker was beaten to death by a mob convinced he was an arsonist. The authorities arrested hundreds of suspects, though no conspiracy was ever proven. A simple-minded French watchmaker named Robert Hubert later confessed to starting the fire and was hanged, though it was obvious he was nowhere near London when it began. By Tuesday, September 4th, the fire reached St. Paul's Cathedral, the spiritual heart of England. Old St. Paul's was one of the wonders of medieval Europe, with a spire that had once risen higher than the pyramids of Giza, though it had lost its spire to lightning a century earlier. The cathedral was surrounded by streets of booksellers and stationers. Pepys estimates that £150,000 worth of books burned, an incalculable loss of knowledge. The lead from the cathedral roof melted and ran down Ludgate Hill in a molten stream. The stones of the cathedral flew like grenades. When the roof finally collapsed, the sound could be heard in Windsor. The cathedral had been used as a warehouse by local merchants who thought its stone walls made it fireproof. They had packed it with their most valuable goods. When it burned, it took with it the accumulated wealth of generations. But more than wealth was lost. The tombs of kings and poets, the medieval archives, the accumulated history of a nation, all turned to ash in a single night. But then, almost miraculously, the wind changed. On Tuesday evening, the strong east wind that had driven the fire for 3 days suddenly died. Without wind to push it forward and spread the embers, the fire began to slow. The firebreaks that Charles and his men had created finally began to work. By Wednesday night, the fire was contained, though small fires continued to burn in cellars and coal stores for weeks. When the smoke cleared, Londoners emerged to survey their transformed city. The numbers are staggering. In 4 days, the fire had destroyed 13,200 houses, 87 churches, 44 livery halls, the Royal Exchange, the Custom House, and countless other public buildings. 373 acres within the city walls and 63 acres outside had been reduced to ash and rubble. Approximately 100,000 people, one-fifth of London's population, were homeless. Yet remarkably, officially only X deaths were recorded, though the true number was certainly higher. Many deaths among the poor and transient went unrecorded. Bodies consumed entirely by such intense heat would leave no trace. But compared to the scale of destruction, the low death toll suggests that London's residents, despite the chaos, managed a relatively orderly evacuation. The immediate aftermath was a humanitarian crisis. 100,000 refugees camped in the fields outside London. Moorfields, Highgate, and Islington became vast tent cities. The king ordered towns across England to accept refugees without requiring the usual settlement papers. He distributed military tents and organized food supplies from the royal stores. For the first time in English history, the government took responsibility for disaster relief on a massive scale. But even as Londoners huddled in tents, mourning their losses, some were already seeing opportunity in the ashes. Within days of the fire's end, proposals for rebuilding began flooding in. The old medieval city was gone. What would replace it? Christopher Wren, the brilliant polymath who was already redesigning St. Paul's before the fire, presented his plan to the king just 6 days after the flames died. His vision was radical, a rational city of wide boulevards radiating from central piazzas, like Paris or Rome. John Evelyn, the diarist and gardener, proposed a grid system with open squares and public gardens. Robert Hooke, the scientist, imagined a city of uniform brick houses along straight streets. These weren't just architectural drawings. They were manifestos for a new kind of city, one designed by reason rather than evolved through accident. But London's merchants had no patience for utopian visions. They needed to rebuild immediately or lose their trade to rivals. The complex web of property rights, some dating back centuries, made any radical replanning impossible. Within weeks, people were already rebuilding on their old foundations. The government, recognizing reality, abandoned the grand schemes and focused on practical improvements. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 was revolutionary in its moderation. It didn't try to create a new Rome, but it laid down principles that would define urban development for centuries. First, all new buildings had to be brick or stone. The age of timber was over. Second, streets were widened and standardized. No more jettying was allowed. Houses had to be built straight up, creating the uniform terraces that still define London's architecture. Third, and most importantly, the Act established building standards based on the type of street. Houses on principal streets had to be 4 stories, on streets of note 3 stories, and on lanes 2 stories. This was the birth of modern building codes. The rebuilding also created entire new professions and industries. Fire insurance, which had barely existed before, became essential. Nicholas Barbin, physician turned property developer, founded the first fire insurance company in 1681. These companies didn't just sell policies, they maintained their own fire brigades, identified by metal fire marks attached to insured buildings. If your building wasn't insured by their company, they might let it burn. It was capitalism, but it worked. London developed the most sophisticated firefighting system in the world. The surveyor became a respected profession. Precise property maps were drawn for the first time. The concept of official addresses was established. Before the fire, houses were identified by carved signs: the Blue Boar, the White Swan. After the fire, systematic street numbering began. The modern postal system became possible. The fire transformed science and technology. The Royal Society, founded just 6 years earlier, made the fire a subject of systematic study. Robert Hooke examined the mechanics of combustion. Christopher Wren experimented with fireproof materials. The disaster became a laboratory for the scientific revolution. Building techniques that emerged from the rebuilding spread across the British Empire. The Georgian terraces of Dublin, Edinburgh, Boston, and Philadelphia all carry the DNA of post-fire London. The new St. Paul's Cathedral, Wren's masterpiece, took 35 years to complete. It was a symbol of the new London, combining English Gothic tradition with Roman Baroque grandeur. Its dome, inspired by St. Peter's in Rome but distinctly English in execution, became the defining landmark of London's skyline for the next 3 centuries. Wren himself designed 51 new churches to replace the 87 destroyed. Each was an experiment in bringing light and Protestant clarity to replace medieval darkness. The social impact was equally profound. The fire accelerated changes that had been building for decades. The old guild system, already weakened by capitalism, collapsed entirely. The livery companies, which had controlled trade since medieval times, lost their halls and much of their authority. A new merchant class, more dynamic and less bound by tradition, emerged from the ashes. The rigid social hierarchies of medieval London gave way to a more fluid commercial society. The fire also changed how people thought about cities. Before 1666, cities were seen as organic entities that grew naturally over centuries. After the fire, people realized cities could be designed, planned, and improved. The idea of urban planning, which we take for granted today, was born in London's ashes. Building regulations, zoning laws, public health measures all have their origins in the Rebuilding Act. The psychological impact lasted generations. The fire entered the English language. The Great Fire needed no other explanation. It became a metaphor for catastrophic change, referenced in literature, politics, and daily conversation. The memory influenced everything from architectural fashion to investment strategies. London developed a culture of prudent paranoia. Buildings were over-engineered. Fire gaps were mandatory. The Thames was lined with water engines. The city that emerged was not beautiful in the classical sense, but it was resilient. The economic recovery was remarkable. Within 2 years, most businesses had reopened. Within 5 years, the port was busier than ever. Within a decade, London had not just recovered but grown. The population that had fled during the fire returned and brought others with them. The cleared ground allowed for new industries. The rebuilt city, with its wider streets and brick buildings, was healthier. The plague, which had killed 100,000 Londoners the year before the fire, never returned with the same virulence. Some historians argue the fire saved more lives than it took by destroying the rat-infested medieval slums where plague flourished. The financial innovations born from the fire transformed global commerce. The insurance principle, tested in London's rebuilding, spread worldwide. Lloyd's of London, which began in a coffee house where ship owners gathered to share risk, became the model for international insurance markets. The joint stock building companies created to finance reconstruction pioneered techniques later used to fund railways, canals, and industrial enterprises. Modern capitalism, in many ways, was forged in the aftermath of the fire. The fire also democratized architecture. Before 1666, great architecture was for churches and palaces. After the fire, ordinary houses were designed by architects. The speculative builders who rebuilt London created the first mass-produced architectural style. The Georgian terrace house, with its mathematical proportions and classical details, made architectural beauty affordable to the middle class. This democratization of design spread throughout the English-speaking world. From Dublin to Boston, Sydney to Singapore, the DNA of post-fire London shaped cities across the globe. Christopher Wren never got to build his Baroque boulevards, but his influence permeated everything. His churches introduced a new religious architecture, filled with light and designed for preaching rather than mystery. His mathematical approach to structure influenced engineering for centuries. The Dome of St. Paul's, with its three shells, a structural cone hidden between decorative inner and outer domes, was an engineering innovation that influenced Capitol buildings worldwide. The U.S. Capitol, state capitals across America, and government buildings from Australia to India all echo Wren's solution to the problem of creating a dome that looks good from both inside and outside. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was philosophical. The fire marked the end of medieval thinking about cities. Before 1666, cities were seen as immutable, their forms set by tradition and divine providence. After the fire, cities became machines that could be improved. Sewers could be engineered. Streets could be widened. Light and air could be designed into the urban fabric. The idea that government had a responsibility for public safety, building standards, and urban planning, concepts we consider fundamental today, were radical innovations born from necessity in 1666. The fire created the template for modern disaster response. The coordination between national government, local authorities, and private citizens, the provision of temporary shelter and food, the systematic approach to rebuilding, all became models for future disasters. When San Francisco burned after the 1906 earthquake, when Chicago burned in 1871, when London itself was bombed during the Blitz, the response followed patterns established in 1666. The Great Fire also transformed memory and record-keeping. The loss of centuries of records in guild halls, churches, and government offices led to new approaches to documentation. Multiple copies of important documents became standard. Fireproof storage was developed. The concept of off-site backup, fundamental to our digital age, has its origins in the lessons of 1666. He meticulous surveys required for rebuilding created the most detailed urban records ever assembled. For the first time, a city knew exactly what it contained. The cultural impact resonates still. The fire created a genre of disaster literature. Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, though about the plague of 1665, was deeply influenced by memories of the fire. The catastrophe entered poetry, theater, and eventually film and television. The image of a city in flames became a powerful metaphor for transformation, revolution, and rebirth. The phrase "London burning" evokes not just destruction, but the possibility of renewal. The fire also changed how we think about monuments and memory. The monument, a 202-foot column designed by Wren and Hooke, was the world's tallest isolated stone column when completed in 1677. It stands exactly 202 feet from where the fire started, its height marking its distance from the origin point. It was the first monument to a disaster rather than a victory, acknowledging that catastrophes, not just triumphs, shape history. The idea that disasters deserve memorials, that we should mark where tragedy occurred to remember and learn, began with the monument. Looking at London today, the fire's legacy is everywhere but invisible. The wide streets of the city, the building lines, the brick and stone facades, all stem from 1666. The financial district's existence, separate from Westminster, was confirmed by the rebuilding that concentrated commerce in the ancient city. The distinctive London architecture, those Georgian squares and uniform terraces that filmmakers love, are direct descendants of post-fire building codes. Even London's famous resilience, its ability to endure the Blitz, terrorist attacks, and economic crashes, carries cultural DNA from 1666. But the deepest legacy is conceptual. The Great Fire taught humanity that cities are not permanent. They can be destroyed in days but rebuilt in years. They can be improved, redesigned, reimagined. The medieval city that burned was the product of 1,000 years of organic growth. The city that replaced it was consciously designed to be better. That idea, that human intelligence can improve on tradition, that disaster can spark innovation, that from the ashes of the old a better world can be built, that's the true gift of the Great Fire to modern civilization. The fire revealed that cities are not just collections of buildings, but systems of human organization. The speed of rebuilding showed that the social and economic networks matter more than physical structures. As long as the people, the knowledge, and the will to rebuild survive, the city survives. London proved that cities are ideas as much as places, and ideas are fireproof. Today, when we talk about resilient cities, smart cities, sustainable cities, we're using concepts born in 1666. The idea that cities should be planned for disaster, that building codes matter, that government has a role in public safety, that insurance can spread risk, that disasters can catalyze innovation, all emerged from the ashes of medieval London. Every modern city carries within its DNA the lessons learned when London burned. The Great Fire destroyed medieval London but created the modern city. It burned away the Gothic maze but revealed the grid beneath. It ended one world and began another. Standing in modern London, surrounded by glass and steel towers that dwarf Wren's churches, it's hard to imagine that city of timber and thatch. But look carefully. In the street patterns, in the building lines, in the very idea that cities can be designed rather than just inhabited, the fire still burns. 4 days in 1666 wrote the source code for urban civilization, not in the grand Baroque boulevards that were never built, but in the mundane miracle of building codes, insurance policies, and addresses. The Great Fire taught us that cities are not eternal monuments but living systems that must adapt or die. It showed us that from the greatest disasters can come the greatest innovations. Most importantly, it proved that the human capacity to rebuild is greater than any force of destruction. That's the paradox of the Great Fire. It was a catastrophe that created opportunity, a disaster that sparked innovation, an ending that was actually a beginning. The London that burned was magnificent, but the London that rose from the ashes changed the world. Because when London rebuilt, it didn't just rebuild houses and churches. It rebuilt the very idea of what a city could be. And that idea, refined and spread across centuries and continents, built the modern world we inhabit today. I'm Michael, exploring the past so we can better understand our world today. Together, we'll keep history alive and fueled. See you in the next era.